Welcome back. I hope you all did your homework. I'm not going to call on people to ask how perfect you are. I figure you can talk about that over lunch. But it should be apparent that that kind of moral inventory isn't a one-time deal. It's not the kind of thing you do so you can get it over with and put it behind you. It's an ongoing thing. But a week like this or 2 weeks like this, when you are suspended from your ordinary routine, is a nice opportunity to take advantage of to do some in-depth reflecting on the state of your character. So I would recommend that. Where are we outline-wise? We are in 3D. We've seen what pride is as a virtue, a commitment to moral excellence. We've seen the value of pride, its unique value in generating self-esteem. And we're in the unit on what pride demands. We talked yesterday about its demanding conscientiousness, introspection, and ambition. And we've just begun talking about perfection. Just to remind you a little bit of yesterday on perfection, we saw that perfection is the flawlessly complete satisfaction of a standard of value. In any realm, that's what perfection is. It's the best possible in a given domain. The finest specimen or the finest performance that it is rational to seek or to expect. As I left off yesterday, I was remarking on how perfection is not a metaphysical status, something in your blood or genes that makes you a perfect person. It's not infallibility, the incapability of making a morally wrong move. And it shouldn't be confused with neurotic perfectionism of the sort that we sometimes criticize. Okay, I want to jump right back into new material then. Not to get lost in all of these misconceptions that I was reviewing at the end last time. Let's return to what perfection is, a profile of the perfect person. A person is morally perfect when he does his best, his real, genuine, honest-to-God best. A commitment to perfection represents the conscious decision to do what you believe you should do, and to figuring out what you should do. Yet Rand gives us an even more helpful account of what perfection means. She tells us the kind of action that one is to do one's best at. I quote from Galt's speech, and this is item D on your handout. Man has a single basic choice, to think or not, and that is the gauge of his virtue. Moral perfection is an unbreached rationality. Not the degree of your intelligence, but the full and relentless use of your mind. Not the extent of your knowledge, but the acceptance of reason as an absolute. So that is the core of it, what perfection boils down to. Unbreached rationality. Since all the virtues are forms of rationality, moral perfection reduces to a single policy, the commitment to follow reason. And Rand is even more specific about how a person might achieve moral perfection. See item E on your handout from the Objectivist Ethics. This is, again, how to achieve perfection. By never accepting any code of irrational virtues impossible to practice, and by never failing to practice the virtues one knows to be rational. By never accepting an unearned guilt and never earning any. Or, if one has earned it, never leaving it uncorrected. By never resigning oneself passively to any flaws in one's character. By never placing any concern, wish, fear, or mood of the moment above the reality of one's own self-esteem. And above all, it means one's rejection of the role of a sacrificial animal. The rejection of any doctrine that preaches self-immolation as a moral virtue or duty. Now that's pretty specific, so I won't add to that. But I will raise a question that a person might have. How does that last part about sacrifice shine in? I mean, you might think, well, yeah, of course it's bad to accept the ideal of sacrifice. We all know that. But what's the connection with pride and perfection? Well, it's an implication of the fact that pride reflects recognition of my life as my highest value. What that translates into in practice is the conviction that nothing and no one is higher. Thus, I will not act as if there's anything higher by sacrificing myself for something else. Being moral is being egoistic. Morality is all about serving and promoting my life. So being perfectly moral requires casting out, hook, line, and sinker, every particle of self-sacrifice. Now, to understand perfection, it's crucial to understand that perfection is contextual. This holds in two senses. Perfection is relative to the situation of human beings, and it's relative to the situation of the particular individual in question. Let me elaborate on each of these. Perfection consists of the highest possible satisfaction of moral standards. What is highest or possible must be understood as relative to the capacities of human beings, however. Obvious as this may sound, the prevailing idea of perfection does not respect it. People commonly treat perfection as demanding performances beyond what is humanly possible. They apologize for apparent shortcomings by pleading, in a perfect world, I would have done such and such. Or if I'd had infinite time to work on this, I would have done thus and so, right? Suggesting that better would have been possible in those fantasized conditions, and that those dictate the proper criteria of evaluation. Fantasy replaces reality as the benchmark of perfection. Now notice that the standard most often used to measure perfection is God, an allegedly almighty, infallible being. Since God is conceived as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, and God's perfection is beyond our comprehension, this standard is confined only by the limits of one's imagination. Right? Since people regard the perfect as the best we can possibly imagine, and we can always imagine better, perfection becomes an elusively lofty ideal, infinitely elastic and inflatable. Problem: a concept of perfection premised on the hypothetical capacities attributed to fictional beings serves no practical purpose. And people seem to realize this in certain other spheres. Think of a pitcher in baseball who throws a perfect game, or a perfect host of a party. Now, in both cases, we can imagine still better performances than those that we praise as perfect. The pitcher might have thrown all strikes, right? He might have thrown not even a single ball. Imagine that. You can imagine that, right? The host might have rewarded guests with generous cash prizes as they left the party, right? Look at this. Now, the reason that we don't demand such things, in order for a person to qualify as perfect, throwing a perfect game, being the perfect host, is our recognition there of the relevance of context. Since the object of the ball game doesn't require all strikes, as long as no opposing batter reaches base, which is the official meaning of a perfect game, the pitcher's team can't lose, there's no reason to expand our notion of a perfect pitching performance. Since the purpose of a party is some combination of celebration, relaxation, stimulating conversation, and the like, but not income enhancement, I don't think even Martha Stewart would require a perfect host to offer financial bonuses. But you never know with Martha, I don't know. And of course, as well, our arms and our bank accounts don't give us the wherewithal to meet such fantasized standards of perfection. So again, these examples testify to the fact that perfection should be construed in context, and moral perfection must be understood as grounded in the actual capacities of human beings. To imply that the infinite is better or offers real perfection reflects rewriting reality. Rand's explanation of perfection is based on our actual capacities and circumstances. It's based on reality, which is the only thing that a rational conception of perfection could be based on. You might say that hers is a down-to-earth conception of perfection as opposed to pie in the sky. But it's important to realize that down-to-earth isn't a come-down. Okay? And that's a point that Harry Binswanger stresses in that article I referred to yesterday, The Possible Dream. The imaginary ain't better. It ain't anything. It's fake, right? It's nothing. It's imaginary. In fact, accepting reality is what allows perfection and truly great accomplishments. Because your attention is not diverted to whining for something else, allegedly superior. That's impossible. Here, as ever, it's being realistic that pays. Holding out perfection as some loftier than reality ideal banishes it from reality, which means that people won't pursue it. Once you define perfection as the never to be reached, you remove it from the realm of literal goals for human beings. It becomes a different kind of thing that pertains to something other than human beings. Okay, now the second sense in which perfection is contextual is individual. A person's best must be understood as relative to his particular circumstances. It cannot be identified apart from his knowledge, his experience, his abilities, resources, or the options available to him. If perfection is an appropriate ideal, it must be a goal that people could actually achieve. A person is not being dishonest, certainly, if he passes along false information that he responsibly believes to be true. A person cannot be faulted as lazy if physical illness prevents him from being as productive as another person. And in this vein, Rand wrote, you can look at F on your handout, if, in a complex moral issue, a man struggles to determine what is right and fails or makes an honest error, he cannot be regarded as gray. Morally, he is white. Errors of knowledge are not breaches of morality. No proper moral code can demand infallibility or omniscience. Or we might add omnipotence, being all-powerful. Now, since a lot of different particulars of an individual's situation can affect what morality demands of him, let me suggest, I think, a helpful little formula to orient your thinking about context, about individual context. You should think about the time, the task, and the doer. Now, I'm not sure this formula captures every relevant aspect of individual context, but I think it's helpful, okay? It might or might not be familiar to you. I got it from Ann Ciccolello, who thinks that she got it from Leonard Peikoff's Understanding Objectivism course years ago, but when we went back and looked at notes, we couldn't find it there, and I asked Harry, and he didn't remember. Is it from, you're nodding, is it from, oh, okay. So it's either from Leonard Peikoff or inspired by Leonard Peikoff, okay? Wouldn't be the first time. So the factors to consider. Time. How much time did a person have to complete the activity in question, right? When you're trying to figure out, was this the best, was this perfect? Was he under the pressure of a deadline? Was he responding to an emergency without opportunity for reflection or research or consultation? Were more pressing tasks occupying his time? The answers to these sorts of questions will directly affect what it's fair or rational to demand of the person. Further, because our lives are finite, it would be irrational to devote equal time to all of our activities. Often a person could do a better job at something if he devoted more time to it. But that doesn't mean that he always should devote more time to that activity. You could spend 45 minutes brushing your teeth every morning, right? You could spend a few hours preparing dinner every morning. I could have spent 2,000 hours preparing these lectures. So we have to consider the amount of time that a person should devote to a particular activity, as well as how much time he has, okay? A person cannot be faulted for failing to treat every activity as if it were his only value or his most important value. The upshot is, perfection depends in part on how much time a person can and should devote to the task in question. This feeds into the second focal point, the task, the activity. How difficult is the task? Does it demand any special knowledge or training, skills, or experience? How important is the task? What is its purpose? Does the person have good reason to engage in it? Stronger or weaker reason than to engage in alternative activities? Now notice, part of how we determine the amount of time that a person should devote to an activity is by considering the significance of that activity. What is its probable impact on the person's life and values? Is it part of his job to do this? Is this his profession? Is this a hobby? I mean, a professional football coach, or the Redskins coach, should devote more time to thinking about strategy than the average Redskins fan should. Okay? And a third element, the person, the doer, the agent, as philosophers sometimes say. How old is he? Think of yourself at different ages, at 16 or at 28 or 34 or whatever. Different expectations were appropriate at different stages in your development. What experience does the person have? Has he had any special training that might be appropriate for the activity in question? How much knowledge does he possess of how it should be done and of all the factors that he should consider in doing it? Is he a rookie or a veteran, an amateur or a professional? What natural talents or deficiencies does this person have that might affect his performance? Is he impaired by any health conditions, physical or mental? Is he engaging in an activity amidst major emotional turbulence? Maybe he's going through a divorce. Maybe he's just lost someone very close to him. The rationale behind all of these considerations should be obvious. People are not equally well equipped for all of life's demands. We don't bring the same background of preparation, knowledge, or abilities to all of our actions. Nor do various activities carry the same value in our lives. A rational standard of perfection must adjust expectations accordingly. To summarize, if perfection means doing your best must be interpreted in light of the realities of who you are, what you are doing, and the time you have in which to do it. You can think of the formula as a rough equation. Time plus task plus doer equals perfection. Alter any one of those three factors, and you've got to correspondingly adjust your idea of what constitutes perfection. Failures, in quotes, failures that a person could not reasonably be expected to have avoided are not marks of defective character. Now, before leaving the contextual character of perfection, I want to raise one last issue, which is important. A lot of people, and a lot of objectivists, feel a little bit uncomfortable when we invoke context. They harbor the suspicion that when we say that morality is contextual, or here that perfection is contextual, we're copping out. They've got the dim sense that it's a concession, a compromise, a relaxing of rigorous moral standards. It's like, you see, this is where even objectivism has to bend a little bit. And I'll confess, I have sometimes thought this, or felt this. This impression is wrong. To think that context relaxes moral standards is to retain an otherworldly standard of perfection. If understanding morality as achievable by heeding the realities of a given individual's situation, if that's a cheapening or a lowering of morality, that implies that the good is that which stands beyond man's reach. It reflects still holding to the premise unconsciously that some imaginary other dimension is preferable to reality and is a more suitable basis for our moral principles. But that makes no sense, since there is no other dimension. So I would also caution here against veering from an intrinsicist view of perfection to a subjectivist one. Against assuming that perfection is either ready-made, a pre-existing standard crafted independently of human beings' actual circumstances, handed down from on high, or it's subjective. And that's all that contextual perfection can mean. We make it up as we go along. We can never criticize anyone's actions. Morality isn't really very rigorous. In fact, perfection's being contextual reflects its being objective. Recognition of the relevance of context does not weaken the demands of perfection. What it does is render them truly attainable, and it thus preserves the goal of perfection as truly useful. It's important to appreciate that a normative standard that is beyond our reach is not a real standard. It fails to serve the function of a moral standard. It fails to do its job. Human beings need moral guidance designed for us, as our nature and circumstances allow us to be. Rejecting an unattainable standard does not mean the loss of something better or higher than contextualized perfection. It means replacing pseudo-guidance, guidance that doesn't really guide, that can't instruct us, with authentic guidance. The importance of context, the need to pay attention to context, reflects the practicality of philosophy. The fact that philosophy truly is to be lived, implemented in action. Its sensitivity to reality, to the facts of a person's capabilities, knowledge, resources, etc., that allows morality to be followed. And that means it really should be. Dr. Peikoff has succinctly captured the ideal. He wrote in Opar that a perfect person, quote, does not demand of himself the impossible, but he does demand every ounce of the possible, close quote. Now, there's no cheapening or compromise in that. And I think the resistance that some of us sometimes feel to context is a remnant of rationalism. It comes from not fully grasping that a rational moral code is based on reality and for being actually practiced in reality. But do we really have to be perfect? I mean, we want to get this straight, right? Objectivism says we're supposed to be perfect. That's our moral obligation. I mean, the reaction from non-objectivists is likely to be, you people have really lost it now, right? And even from many objectivists, I think the reaction might be, why can't I just be good? Very good. Very good. Okay, B+. And not a grade inflated B+, but a gold standard B+. Really very good, right? You know, I mean, life is hard. I'm tired. Perfect. Well, first point to raise is a counter question. If perfection means unbreached rationality, what's to breach it? No one is doomed to suffer the corruption of his rationality. Irrationality isn't some alien force, like a virus that invades a person's mind over which you have no control. The rationality of your thinking and action is wholly within your hands. Unbreached rationality means that whenever you act, based on everything you know at that stage in time, based on the best of your reasoning capacities as developed to that point, you do what is rational, what is based on your first-hand observation of facts and of the logical relationships between those facts. That's doable. Second point, as to why isn't being good, or being basically good, or being mostly good, good enough? Because A is A, because of reality. At the most fundamental level, the requirement of moral perfection rides piggyback on the case for morality, which is itself a response to the fact that A is A. Or even more accurately, we might say, the case for perfection just is the case for morality. Truly, there's no separate argument for perfection. There's not one argument for being moral, and then some different one for being perfectly moral. Perfection consists of an uncompromised devotion to acting as one's moral code prescribes, as best you can. We should do that for the same reason that we should be moral. Now, I'm not going to take the time to rehearse objectivism's explanation of why you should be moral. I'm sure you're all familiar with that, and there's lots of good writing on that. But let me remind you of a few essentials most relevant to this issue. The bottom line determinant of what a person should do is what he must do in order to live. It is facts, hard and fast, non-negotiable truths about human needs, human capacities, and the effects of different kinds of actions that dictate how to lead one's life. And it is the same absolutism of these facts that requires moral perfection. Dabbling in morality, acting as you should occasionally, sporadically, when in the mood, or even acting morally most of the time, will not suffice. Morality is a response to ineradicable facts about our nature and the requirements of our survival. Ignoring those facts doesn't change them. Thus, any time you deviate from the moral course, you're playing with fire. You're jeopardizing your life and all your values. Because the facts that your life depends on do not change simply because you're not in the mood to respect them. You can put it this way. The primacy of existence withstands your not feeling like exerting the effort to focus and act rationally. This is the fundamental reason that morality requires perfection. Because the facts giving rise to morality are absolute, morality's prescriptions are absolute. The same rationale for acting morally in the first place, to advance one's life, also tells a person to act very morally, uncompromisingly, 100%. Strictly, moral perfection is redundant, as Dr. Binswanger points out in that article. Moral principles do not admit of compromise. To be moral is to be perfect. And notice, you'd have to think that morality does not truly require being practiced in order to expect some additional case for the especially laudable feat of practicing your moral code. Right? Now, let me quickly raise two more aspects of this absolutism argument. One is the likelihood that evil, immorality, if uncorrected, will spread. This is something that Dr. Peikoff discusses in OPAR in regard to reason and emotionalism in chapter 5, and again later in his discussion of integrity. So I would point you there for much fuller explanation. But let's just notice, if you allow yourself a few immoralities, just enough to feel too confined by morality, or just enough to be, a regular guy, not perfect or anything like that, just a normal guy, right? If you accept being imperfectly moral as your version of the objectivist ethics, those black patches are likely to grow, and you're making your life harder. Existentially, when you engage in these immoralities, you've taken a retreat from your values, instead of seizing an opportunity to secure them or to advance your values. Psychologically, you've weakened a tendency to act well, and you've strengthened a tendency to act badly, deepening a groove that works against you. You're now juggling two contradictory ideals of behavior, rational and irrational. You encounter every decision knowing, I'm the kind of person who acts rationally, honestly, justly, independently, etc. And also knowing, I'm the kind of person who acts irrationally, dishonestly, unjustly, whatever the particular lapse might be, right? So which will it be now on any given occasion? Well, now these conflicting ideals are going to have to battle it out. You've reopened an issue that should have been closed, which only raises the likelihood of further immoral actions. By imperfection, you are weakening yourself. What's going to decide which side wins this battle, the rational or the irrational side of you? Well, notice, by making peace with some irrationality, you've abandoned reason as your highest authority. In other words, all of a sudden, you've given yourself real trouble now. The other thing I wanted to notice is this. Earlier, yesterday, we saw pride's distinctive value in underwriting self-esteem. Well, breaches of your moral code are incompatible with that value. Whether it's through big blows or little nicks and jabs here and there, imperfection chips away at it. Your self-esteem can't withstand imperfection. Let me close this discussion of why we really need to be perfect with a couple of final observations. The requirements of pride reflect the fact that ours is a purposeful morality, a morality with a job to do. We have to be ambitious and not simply satisfy the moral rules. We have to seek perfection because morality consists of more than following orders. It's not a matter of just satisfying some external demands that are handed down to us. Morality isn't about staying out of trouble with some god who issued these arbitrary commands. Rand established that morality is the means of making your life, materially and spiritually. Morality has a positive goal to achieve, and you are in the best position to achieve it the more completely moral you are. And let's also make explicit something that should be apparent. You should be perfect because it's selfish. And this relates to the question that Dr. Kenner raised yesterday. Perfection is completely egoistic. There is no reason to be perfect other than to serve your well-being. And there's no way to see the value of perfection or to be motivated to cultivate the virtue of pride unless you recognize this. Imperfection is bad because it's bad for you. That's always what's at stake in morality. Your life, your happiness. So if you're thinking, I'm basically good, I try to be rational, I come to these conferences, I read TIA, do I really have to worry about being perfect? Isn't being good good enough? The answer is no. And the reason is you can get more out of life. Cheating morality is cheating yourself, endangering your values, and depriving yourself of the best life you could have. I think that a commitment to perfection largely comes down to asking yourself, do you want it? Do you really want it? Do you want your life to be the best it could possibly be? Imperfection sometimes seems easier. That's why it's tempting, right? It seems like it offers a shortcut to your interest. But there are no shortcuts around reality. When Ayn Rand recognized rationality as the only way to successfully deal with reality, when she recognized morality as a more specific elaboration of how to be rational, she basically cornered the market on ways of advancing your self-interest. She covered all the bases. In a letter, Ayn Rand wrote, "People say that idealism is impractical. Nothing is practical except idealism." Reminding yourself of the selfish practicality of morality should help you to remember that moral perfection is not about genuflecting to some deity or to morality as an end in itself. It's not about keeping a good record in some official moral bookkeeping. Being perfectly moral is the only path to your values and your happiness. Why limit the limitless? Objectivism's embrace of the possibility of perfection and the propriety of perfection is striking because it is completely at odds with the prevailing views around us. Everybody takes for granted that perfection is impossible. Liberals, conservatives, traditionalists, relativists, postmodernists, academics, ordinary Joes. And they do take it for granted. It's not even a question. So before moving on, I'd like to comment on why this assumption is not just mistaken, but pernicious, and why it's important to battle it, why it really should be on our hit list. The acceptance of imperfection makes a mockery of morality. To deny moral perfection's possibility undermines the possibility of taking morality seriously. If perfection properly means doing one's best, satisfying a moral code to the highest degree possible, whatever that code happens to be, right? Whether it's objectivist or religious or utilitarian or Kantian or whatever, right? If perfection means satisfying a moral code to the highest degree possible, and we tell people that they are not obligated to be perfect, what are we doing? We're condoning immorality. In areas where people could do better, we'd be granting them permission to not do better, to be satisfied with less than moral action. But this renders morality a farce. It fractures morality into contradictory messages. Your moral code instructs, be moral, live by these principles. The doctrine that perfection is impossible adds, but not really, or not when it's unpleasant or inconvenient, requires discipline or too much effort. Right? A classic instance of these mixed messages is found in Kant, who wrote, "We have, quote, an imperfect duty to be perfect," close quote. Now, what's a person supposed to do with that? What's a young Eddie Willers supposed to do with that? When people are surrounded by the presumption that perfection is unattainable, what's the natural inference to draw? Well, they logically translate the premise that they cannot be perfect into the conclusion that they're not obligated to be perfect. By professing the unattainability of moral perfection, we give our blessing to immoral actions. People are encouraged to treat morality as a charade. So many words, so many motions, but at its core, not essential guidance. One symptom of this that some of you might have encountered, I don't know, I've encountered this, are people who justify a particular moral failing by reassuring themselves, at least I feel guilty about it. Have you run into this? Right? They treat guilt as if it were a substitute for moral action. The operative assumption is that a person faces a choice between two equally valid moral options: doing the right thing, acting as one should, or not doing so but feeling badly afterwards. Well, if you treat the feeling of guilt as equally good, that implies a conception of morality as something whose actual practice carries no significant stakes. Now, opponents might argue with us at this point. They might say, look, claiming that perfection is impossible doesn't endorse perfection. It simply, allegedly realistically, recognizes the fact of it. But we're not denying that imperfection exists. What I'm disputing is the idea that the perfection that we encounter is inevitable. My point is, accepting the necessity of imperfection is a roundabout way of sanctioning it. To the extent that people try to be fair, they will use the presumed inevitability of human imperfection to excuse particular incidents of imperfection. If a person regards it as inescapably in the nature of the beast to be imperfect, then actual episodes of imperfection cannot constitute grounds for complaint about a person's behavior. You could hold imperfection against a person no more than you could hold his need for oxygen or water against him. Once you deem imperfection inevitable, you cut off any grounds for moral censure. The effect is to grant immorality a pass from moral condemnation. Now, accepting the idea that perfection is impossible won't spell the immediate, utter collapse of all of a person's efforts to act morally. Lots of people believe that perfection is beyond their reach, yet they still try to be moral, to some extent. But that qualification is crucial. They try half-heartedly, armed with the reassuring conviction that when the going gets tough, When a specific immoral choice is especially tempting, perfection is unavailable anyway. In other words, in a situation where a person is actually making a decision, struggling between the immoral and the moral choice, the belief that perfection is impossible can't help but ease the wayward path. If consistently making right choices is a pipe dream, then it is precisely in those situations when one does struggle that this premise will conveniently justify immoral action. Let's not kid ourselves. Ideas inform our actions. The impossibility doctrine is not just a theoretical tenet suspended above the arena of actual decisions. It influences our thinking when we're evaluating our options. It's a particularly handy excuse when a person is searching for a prop to support doing something that he wants to do in spite of his awareness that he should not do it. Lots of people will not take immoral actions cavalierly, brazenly flouting morality. They'll hunt around for some plausible justification of an immoral action. The conviction that perfection is impossible hands them a ready-made rationalization for immoral choices. It's a lifeline for evasion. So, the upshot. The doctrine that perfection is impossible transmits a message that is fatal to morality, to any morality. Urging people to be moral, while we're all winking on the cozy assumption that that's impossible, undermines the efficacy of all moral guidance. People are not fools. Confronted with contradictory counsel, you must be moral, you can't, and therefore don't have to be moral, many people subconsciously draw the logical inference, namely, morality is not fundamentally to be taken seriously. And in this way, the idea that perfection is impossible contributes to the widespread, unspoken idea that morality is a game. It's something that we talk about, we pay lip service to, but we don't really regard it as all that important. If actions, or since actions speak louder than words, if moral action isn't insisted upon, as it isn't when we dismiss perfection as an unrealistic ideal, then our words about morality are hollow. Okay, all of this last whole section today, and some of yesterday, all of this has been an elaboration of what pride demands. Before leaving that subject, I want to devote a little attention to implementation. If the aim, as I stated at the introduction yesterday, if the aim is to have us exercise the virtue of pride more actively, what might help that? I'm not a psychologist, and different tactics might work better or worse for different individuals, okay? So I have the usual government disclaimers here. But I do want to offer a few observations that I think might be helpful. All of this talk about how possible perfection is shouldn't mislead us into supposing that it is easy, or that for any sincere objectivist it's going to be a piece of cake. If you expect it to be easy, then you might be really thrown when you find that it isn't. Acting morally is never automatic. Each of us has our own issues, areas where we might find it particularly challenging to be perfectly moral for whatever reason. Perfection demands doing your best, and even when you take account of context, a person's best will often require discipline in the face of conflicting desires. It will require thinking and staying with a line of thought to remind yourself of how this option isn't going to be good for you, and this other option really is. The phrase, "I did my best," has deteriorated into a throwaway line. I mean, this is a scandal. This just angers the hell out of me, but it's really become meaningless as it is most often used. People use it when they don't want to confront the character of what they're doing. It's become a kind of catch-all dispensation, invoked to banish twinges of self-reproach. Properly, "I did my best" should be sacred words. used selectively, with care and precision. The point here is simply, doing your best isn't always going to be a piece of cake, so you should be prepared to exert some effort if you really want to strengthen your virtue of pride. Second issue under implementation. Suppose I set out to be more proud. How can I tell if I'm being perfect? How do I measure it? By what yardstick? Well, remind yourself of passage D from Rand that we read earlier. I'm not going to reread it here, but I would point you back to that and say simply this: the objectivist morality boils down to rationality. Thus, Dr. Peikoff tells us in Opar, you should judge yourself good or evil on the basis of one thing: your volitional use of your tool of survival, your maintenance of focus. That's the yardstick. There's nothing more mysterious to perfection than that. Third issue. How self-conscious should the pursuit of perfection be? And this is the question that Dr. Locke raised yesterday. Do we need to consciously set out to be perfect? Should a person walk away from these lectures thinking about perfection more often? Should the word surface more regularly throughout your days? I don't know. I don't have a single clear answer on this. I think you do need to make a conscious commitment to perfection. That's why pride is a distinct virtue. A person needs to recognize the need to work on his character. And objectivism certainly urges us to be in focus. It doesn't preach, here, accept this moral code, and then follow it blindly. No questions asked, no further attention necessary, right? Now, I'm not sure that that means that you need to think of the word perfection dozens of times daily. I doubt it, but I'm not sure. And you might want to try it. I mean, you know, some of you might want to try it, and if it helps get you to be more moral, that's great. That's wonderful, right? It can be inspiring to identify your goal very forthrightly. There can be value in explicitly invoking perfection as a reminder of the propriety of holding yourself to really high standards. What I would caution against is focusing on the grading of your action. Beware falling into the scorekeeping mentality. Was that perfect? Was that an A minus, right? Doing a lot of that. That can be a real distraction and a distortion of what morality is all about. What's right is right not because it's going to make me a good little girl, but because it's going to enhance my self-interest. Wanting to maintain one's pride, a good reputation with oneself, can be motivating. And sometimes it's helpful to think, I don't want to blemish myself. But it's simply important to remember the reason why it's bad to act immorally. The reason to be honest, for example, isn't, and then you get to pat yourself on the back. The reason is faking things doesn't change things. I would also caution against what I think of as the Homerun Syndrome. I have in mind the baseball slugger who's so intent on hitting a homer, he strikes out. He swings for the fences and he misses the ball entirely, right? He's so concerned with doing something great, hitting the homer, that he ends up not even doing anything good. The thought of being perfect can be daunting. If you spend a lot of time thinking, gotta be perfect, gotta be perfect, the pressure could be paralyzing. It could keep you from taking the small steps you need to. It can keep you from having your eye on the ball instead of the fences on each decision as it arises. Just as it makes sense to break any big project into manageable chunks, it makes sense to tackle moral perfection by realizing we achieve perfection one day at a time. One morning, one afternoon, one decision at a time. So when you think about being perfect, you might aim to be perfect today, or this morning, or now, by staying in focus, by making right, rational choices. It is important to being perfect to heed something that Ayn Rand wrote in her journals. Never treat a word or a moment as if it doesn't count, she wrote. Being morally great, I think, isn't different in kind from being morally good. It's a matter of being morally good again and again, treating each decision as if it counts. Finally, but very importantly, the focus here should not be on how imperfect you might be. The purpose of the lectures and of the virtue of pride isn't to get people to beat themselves up. Encouraging you to introspect about your character isn't intended to depress you or get you to harp on deficiencies. Pride and perfection are about growing, about doing our best and reaping the best. So you might concentrate on the verb, perfecting. Pride is about becoming ever more consistently, tightly, purely rational, purely moral, and ever more happy. It's about being more fully selfish. So keep your eyes on the prize, you might say, in putting this virtue into practice. Okay, Unit 4 then. Our last task. I know I'm going a little bit fast today, but I'd like to finish and still have time for questions, so. 2 seconds to breathe, and now our last task. Okay, our last task is to consider the opposition to pride. Pride is not celebrated in our society, to say the least. If anything, it is vilified. Pride goes before destruction, the Old Testament tells us. Pride is the beginning of all sin, St. Augustine. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself shall be exalted, the New Testament. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, according to the Roman Catholic Church. And even in everyday conversation, references to pride are usually preceded by some negative adjective. It's stubborn pride, or foolish pride, or overweening pride, right? Stubbornness and foolish pride caused us to push love aside. The Supremes. Anybody remember that? Now, what's the source of this hostility? What are its philosophical underpinnings? They're not hard to see, and we find some of the usual suspects at work. But I think it's useful to see how these operate to show what we have to battle to clear a path for a rational understanding of pride and perfection. One flank of opposition is premised on a low evaluation of human nature. According to this view, man is base. Human beings are not able and not worthy, so we have no reason to pursue pride or perfection. On many religious views, original sin stains us from birth. Yet even many non-religious people agree that human beings can never rise above inborn defects. We can never escape our inherent depravity. There's a long and continuing tradition of thinking that any assertion of human perfection, or even any aspiration to perfection, is an affront to divinity, or simply getting too big for your britches, not knowing your place in the grander scheme of things. The point is, to anyone with a sufficiently low opinion of man, the idea of man's attaining perfection, or being proud, seems preposterous. And remember how dark some opinions of human nature have been. Augustine saw the mass of mankind as, quote, cankered at the roots. He referred to himself as foul, crooked, sordid, bespotted, and ulcerous. Right? Of course, that shows that even bad guys can get some things right sometimes. Cheap joke there. John Calvin agreed that man is incapable of performing any action that is not in some degree corrupted. Kant concurred. Quote, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. Close quote. Now, I only learned that little gem from Kant a few years ago, when a prominent political philosopher used part of that as a title for his own collection of essays, indicating that the sentiment there that Kant expressed is alive and well. To whatever extent a person accepts this portrait of human nature, pride and perfection are out of the question. The ancient Greeks, who had a much more positive view of man, by and large urged pride and perfection. Perfection of mind and body was a defining feature of Greek culture. Aristotle wrote, though this wasn't, by the way, this wasn't in his discussion of pride, but elsewhere in his Ethics, Aristotle wrote, "We must strain every nerve to do the noblest deeds." But you can think that that effort is worth the trouble if you're wedded to a bleak conception of human nature. To offer a rough analogy, just as an individual needs self-esteem to act morally, we need human being esteem to recognize pride and perfection as appropriate aims for human beings. Another major source of opposition to pride is the reigning conception of morality, the firm grip of altruism. Notice the overlap between some objectivist virtues and mainstream virtues. Lots of people praise justice, honesty, integrity. Now, even though the conventional accounts of what those are and why they are virtuous are completely at odds with objectivism, we hear considerable lip service paid to those as ideals. Not so with pride. Positive references to pride are much scarcer. Why? Because pride represents an unabashed celebration of one's own life. Pride says, go for it, full throttle, no holds barred, and enjoy it. Enjoy yourself. Man-hatred can't stomach that. Honesty and justice, by contrast, seem useful to others. They seem to be of social value. It's much easier to give them an altruistic spin. The conventional explanation of honesty? It facilitates social intercourse. It allows others to rely on you. Justice, conventionally, is understood as fairness to others, sometimes at the expense of your own interest. Right? They've got no clue that being objective is actually in your interest. Even integrity is usually portrayed as fidelity to altruistic obligations. Grit your teeth and bear it for the good of the community. Further notice that when we do occasionally see pride cast in a positive light, usually it is cast in this light for its social benefits. In the few instances when people are ready to applaud pride, it's pride taken in some group association, primarily, or some collective enterprise, or when pride is presented as advantageous to others. Ethnic pride, that's okay, that's group, right? Gay pride, another group. Company pride, the pride at Ford Motors, or the pride in the Marine Corps, these are going to better serve you, give you a better product, give you a better military. Altruism can permit pride only as long as it's valuable to others. Pride that is not so other-directed, however, is usually seen as out of bounds. Humility, on the other hand, is far more congenial to altruism. The belief that a person should deflate his own importance and curtail his desires paves the way for sacrifice to others. To the extent that humility mitigates love of self, it weakens a potential obstacle to a person's making altruistic offerings. So the point is, much hostility to pride arises from the simple fact that the prevailing moral ideas favor self-sacrifice. Many people resist the individualism they detect in pride. Pride represents a direct celebration of one's own life. Pride is thoroughly, unapologetically egoistic. You will experience the feeling of pride when you love your life and act like it, by practicing a life-advancing morality with ambitious dedication. Why do so many people readily assume that perfection is impossible and pride is vicious? Why do so many comparatively rational, good people assume this? And I mean good in the sense that they're people who seem to take morality seriously and try to abide by their beliefs. It was really this question that got me interested in working on perfection in particular some more. When a lot of my better graduate students, not objectivists, but relatively smart, rational, sincere people, just assume that perfection is impossible. Why is this? Well, the reason, I think, is they cannot conceive of a set of moral principles that can actually be practiced consistently. Most people simply equate morality with a code that demands the impossible, self-sacrifice. It is ingrained in them that morality means selflessness, and they know, at least implicitly, that complete self-sacrifice is impossible. It means suicide. Thus, they conclude moral perfection is impossible. Now, of course, if you're committed to altruism, your moral code needs a loophole. And that's exactly what the impossibility of perfection thesis provides. A code demanding self-destructive actions needs an escape hatch. If people believed that they were obligated to practice altruism consistently, and if they were unequivocally condemned for failing to do so, rather than having it chalked up to incorrigible human nature, the irrationality of that code would become readily apparent. As long as we assure one another that no one can practice any moral code perfectly, however, our attention is diverted from the content of the code that we're urged to adopt. If altruism declared, be an altruist and we mean it, practice self-sacrifice really, fully, 100%, its appeal would quickly evaporate. So the reigning conception of morality, altruism, is a deep stream of opposition to pride. Altruism has a vested interest in perpetuating the myth that perfection is impossible, to disguise the irrationality of its demands. The idea that imperfection is inevitable shields altruism's respectability by distracting people's scrutiny from the kinds of actions that altruism provides. When people fail to abide by altruism, the fault is attributed to people rather than to the moral prescriptions being urged. And just as the denial of perfection helps altruism to retain a good name, altruism helps to give perfection a bad name. It makes it seem as if you really can't be perfect. Altruism also thrives on guilt. That's a theme that comes up repeatedly in Atlas, but I had very little to say about that, and I'll skip it in the interest of time. I've spoken of a view of man and a view of morality as important sources of opposition to pride. I think, though, that there's another something operating that's maybe even more basic in a lot of people's assumption that perfection is impossible and pride is just vicious. This assumption provides a glimpse not only into a person's metaphysical or moral outlooks, but also into his attitude toward philosophy itself. The common rejection of pride and perfection rests largely on the fact that people don't take ideas seriously. They don't regard ideas as to be practiced. That's what allows them, even many of the better people, to be so cavalier about endorsing a moral code that they don't fully practice. In contrast, understanding the propriety of pride, of a commitment to achieve one's moral perfection, reflects grasping the imperative to live by ideas. It reflects grasping that philosophical theories, a moral code, are not just words, just theory, but that philosophy is for action. For some of us, digesting this depends on weeding out rationalism, as I mentioned earlier. Resistance to perfection can come from not fully digesting that a moral code is something to live by. The resistance can stem from a divide in a person's understanding of the relationship between a theory of morality and the importance of implementing it in practice. A divide that can infect a person's system, making it very difficult for a true theory of morality to be persuasive to them. or even if it is persuasive, to really wholly take root. In other words, for non-objectivists, if they're carrying around the entrenched unconscious assumption that ideas aren't really to be practiced, then the contradictions of false moral theories aren't going to bother them, so they won't be motivated to pursue a rational morality. But also for many objectivists, even after rejecting our previous moral views, this erroneous premise about the role of philosophy to be practiced can be so ingrained that you don't realize you're still carrying it. And it can keep you from appreciating why pride and perfection are a vital part of the package of the objectivist ethics. So while I'm sure you're not tempted to man-hatred or to altruism, those first sources of opposition to pride, I think some of us might be tempted to this or still have it hidden within us, so it's something else to be on the lookout for. Let me shift gears a bit, though I'm still on this general theme of a view of philosophy as instrumental in opposing pride. Lots of people, and certainly lots of academic philosophers, would be very uncomfortable with lectures like these that I've given yesterday and today. And it's, well, I mean, that may not be surprising, but it's not just the content, the specific claims I've made that they would disagree with. Of course they disagree with those, but philosophers disagree with each other up and down the board. That's what they, that's their bread and butter. That's what they do for a living. That's not the surprising, right? I mean, they're not in it for the truth, they're just in it for the fight, right? They would have, though, I think, to this sort of lecture and to certain of my other academic writing, a further negative reaction. They'd be put off by the tone. It would strike them as preachy, moralistic. Now, of course, you might think, she's a moral philosopher, right? Isn't the role of moral philosophers to be moralistic? Well, they'd reply, yeah, but, What they don't like about this sort of thing, I think, is that it takes morality seriously. It treats morality as if it is to be practiced, as if words, theories, really are to inform our actions. Heaven knows that that's a large part of what made Ayn Rand's writings so powerful and so hated by some. Her writing about politics, for instance, probably wasn't convincing to you or threatening to her enemies because she unearthed previously unknown economic data about the differences between communism or a capitalist society. Rather, what pervades all of her writing is her recognition that ideas mean something. And she treated words like they meant something. Doing that, she exposed what so many irrational ideas mean, and she offered us a wealth of rational ideas and rational practices to replace them with. So my point here is simply this. One of these ideas that she gave us about the nature and value of pride, the fact that you must be morally ambitious and committed to your moral perfection, itself reflects taking ideas, taking philosophy seriously, which is what her opponents on this, as on so many issues, fail to do. We're at the conclusion, don't worry. Aristotle held pride in high esteem, designating it the crown of the virtues. He deserves our esteem for recognizing value in pride. But it was Ayn Rand who made clear how pride could be not merely a positive feeling, not merely a positive judgment about oneself, but a virtue. Rand recognized that the virtue of pride is forward-looking, instructing a person's action, and that pride is not simply a backward-looking sense of satisfaction. Rand identified that a person must earn high self-regard by virtuous action, and she explained how vital such self-regard is in a person's life. To recap a few of our chief findings. Pride is moral ambitiousness, a commitment to learn what a rational moral code prescribes and to live by that code 100%. It's a matter of making yourself a hero by shaping your character in the image of your moral ideals. Pride requires that you hold yourself to the highest standards in abiding by your code. It requires introspection and honest self-assessment of where you stand morally and where you need to go. Pride requires ambition, striving for continual improvement. And pride requires perfection, unbreached rationality. Contextual, but honest to reality, perfection. And pride's value, we have seen, rests partially in its bolstering one's practice of other virtues and thus maximizing the correlative rewards, partially in making explicit the demands implicit in other virtues, and principally in building the indispensable value of self-esteem. By living literally as best you can, you make yourself able and worthy. You earn the status of being your own highest value. I hope that the result of our probing is the goal that I stated at the outset yesterday, to awaken a virtue that, if not altogether dormant, is too often a little groggy, to activate and unleash the power of pride in our everyday lives. Let me close on a personal note. Yesterday, I referred to Ayn Rand's description of pride as moral ambitiousness as one of my favorite phrases in all of Rand's writing. And in working on this material, I asked myself, why is that? Why do I find that so captivating? Think about what morality is. A tool that enables you to live and prosper, to flourish and be happy. Morality serves your life. To be morally ambitious is to pursue your life hungrily. Given the true nature of morality, then, moral ambition is life ambition. Practicing pride comes down to loving your life, actively, tenaciously, indefatigably, as well as you can. That, I think, is a beautiful thing. Thank you.
Intellectuals are not serious about ideas, which is certainly true, but also they're adamantly opposed to certainty of any kind. Do you see a connection between those two factors, or are they both the consequence of bad epistemology?
That's a good question. And I really haven't thought about that connection between certainty in regard to pride in particular. But it would seem like there is a connection. I mean, pride is based on saying, yeah, good, way to go. I mean, the feeling of pride certainly is based on an unqualified positive nod toward yourself. Well, the unqualified doesn't fit with the skepticism, the rejection of certainty that is so prevalent. So I'm sure that that's part of the opposition, but I definitely think in the case of pride, definitely, melded with it's too damn selfish, right? It's too damn about yourself and enjoying yourself and your life. It's not other-directed and altruistic and sacrificial as it should be. But yeah, I'd want to think more about that, and certainly the certainty in pride, the conviction, okay? And again, we've talked about morality as an ongoing thing, and you've always got to keep earning your self-esteem, but that kind of certainty itself is anathema. You're certainly right, yeah.
Being just is certainly part of the issue of having a high moral character. Could you comment on the difference between judging and judgmental, and how you evaluate that when you are evaluating your own character?
I'm sorry, the difference between judging and judgment?
No, judging and being judgmental.
Oh, and being judgmental. Well, being judgmental is another of these things that's gotten a bad rap in the culture. Wrong. culture, right? I mean, we should be judgmental. Now, properly, we should be rationally judgmental. We should judge issues rationally. We should judge people rationally, objectively. But, I mean, when most people say, don't be judgmental, they're not criticizing the way you're making your judgment. They're not saying, oh, you overlooked factors A and B, or you're being too emotional. Generally, when people denounce being judgmental, it's the judgment per se that they're objecting to, and that is just mistaken. We need to be judgmental. We need to judge everything in front of us. True, false, good, bad. You know, people, inanimate objects, things, events. So I think if somebody's knocking being judgmental, it's a good idea to ask them, well, exactly what is it you mean? What is it that you're objecting to here? Because the judgment per se is not something that should be objected to.
You mentioned in passing the difference between intellectuals who are in it for the fight and those who are in it for the truth.
Yeah, that was not in the script.
I just thought that was very insightful, and I was wondering if you would elaborate a little bit on it.
Oh. Well, those of you who are in academia, and I don't know if this is greater in philosophy, well, it's probably greater in philosophy than at least some fields, than in some of the sciences, for instance. The fight is what it's all about. It's all about the argument, the scuffle. That's what we do in the journals. And it's all about, well, does he have a good argument? That never means, is it true? Should I change my mind? Has he that question doesn't enter their minds. It's just, is that a good argument means, ooh, there are a few good points there that I could have something to say on. So the argument, the dialogue, which is good in itself, could continue. Okay? That's not just prevalent in philosophy, that's what academic philosophy is. Yeah. And truth is naive, really, it's like, where is she coming from? Oh, little girl. Really, it's seen as very naive to be interested in truth.
Well, first of all, thank you for 2 great lectures. I wanted to ask about your characterization of moral perfection. You said that moral perfection means satisfying a moral code to the highest degree possible. And that seems to make it look like there are 2 issues. What does the code require? And then how fully can we satisfy that? Mm-hmm. So it seemed to make it sound as if you could be morally perfect without fully satisfying your moral principles if they're not fully satisfiable. So it seemed like there was a kind of Platonist remnant there. So I just wanted to ask you to talk more about moral perfection.
Sure I get really what you're saying. Where does the split come in from saying?
If to be morally perfect is to satisfy your moral principles to the highest degree possible, right, it seems to leave open the possibility maybe the highest degree possible isn't the full satisfaction of what that moral code requires, which I'm sure wasn't in your intended
Well, I would
implications.
Think that and I don't know, maybe we can talk about this more. Yeah. But I would think that having the contextual understanding of perfection, grounded in the realities of what actions are possible for this person, I would think that takes care of that, or keeps it grounded in reality as opposed to floating in some other standard. I don't know, though, if that really...
Yeah, that might do it. I was just wondering what more you might have to say about that.
Okay.
Thanks.
I understand what you said in terms of the general population when they say, I did my best, as a toss-off. I think you called it a throwaway phrase. But for us, who are seeking moral perfection, you said that we should only say it selectively, whereas it seemed to me that we should be saying it all the time.
We should say it whenever it's true.
Well, thank you.
No, right. We should say it whenever it's true. And the whole idea of being proud is make it true more and more often, right? That's how you get better, by doing your best more and more. So certainly I hope that a lot of us can say it very often. And I think, objectivists by and large tend to be people who are entitled to say it about a lot of what they do. That is what's so admirable about you people, right? But when I say use it selectively, use it when it's true, right? And not when it's false. And when you're saying it with a little question mark in the side of your mind, pursue that little question mark before just asserting cavalierly, I did my best, okay? Any other questions? Okay, thanks.